Western aircraft. One Iraqi MiG-25 was confirmed to have downed an American FA-18 Hornet during the opening stages of Operation Desert Storm. Today, less than a handful of countries maintain an active fleet of MiG-25s, including Libya, Syria, and Algeria. The Russian Air Force retired the last of its Foxbats in the mid-2010s. Despite its questionable construction and relatively poor performance in combat, the MiG-25 excelled in its primary role as an interceptor. By design, interceptors are intended to fly fast against unidentified aircraft and thus have fewer defensive armaments than a typical air superiority fighter. Whether guarding the Soviet frontier or flying patrols over the Mediterranean, the MiG-25 Foxbat was a common sight during the latter decades of the Cold War. From the Arab world to the Iron Curtain, Foxbat Tales is the definitive operational and combat history of the MiG-25. Chapter 1. Birth of an Interceptor. The story of the Mikoyan-Gurevich MiG-25 begins in the inaugural decade of the Cold War. As the ideological divide between East and West grew more fervent, so too did their respective methods of intelligence gathering. The development of long-range reconnaissance aircraft was perhaps the most conspicuous example of the ongoing game of geopolitical brinksmanship. Although NATO had kept a close eye on the development of Soviet aircraft throughout the 1950s, none of the communists' airframes gave cause for concern among the Western intelligence community. Aside from the Tupolev Tu-95 Bear and the latter-day MiG-21, NATO had little regard for any aircraft within the Warsaw Pact inventory. This relative complacency, however, had ended by the dawn of the 1960s. In May 1960, for example, an American U-2 spy plane was shot down by a Soviet surface-to-air missile near Sverdlovsk. This surprise shoot-down demonstrated that the U.S. could no longer fly unhindered reconnaissance missions over Soviet territory. Prior to this U-2 loss, NATO had regarded the Soviet Air Defense Forces, PVO Protivovo-Dushnaya Obrona, as little more than a paper tiger. To make matters worse, as the U.S. began the first of its abortive experiments with the F-111, the Soviet Union unveiled two new bombers, Myasishchev M-50 Bounder and Tupolev Tu-22 Blinder, and two new interceptors, YE-152A Flipper and Tupolev Tu-128 Fiddler. These new planes, although untested in combat, were enough to gain the attention of NATO's frontline intelligence community. To this point, the PVO had been relying on a rapidly aging fleet of day interceptors, most of which were easily outrun by the current inventory of NATO aircraft. Meanwhile, to strengthen the PVO's intercept capabilities, Soviet design bureaus, including Yakovlev, Sukhoi, and Mikoyan-Gurevich, submitted prototypes for what they hoped would be the next generation of Soviet interceptors. Yakovlev and Mikoyan-Gurevich respectively developed the Yak-27V and MiG-19SU variants, both of which had rocket-propelled engines. However, neither aircraft proceeded beyond the prototype phase. Sukhoi, meanwhile, developed the Su-9 Interceptor, achieving operational status in 1959. Its flight range, however, was severely limited, thus rendering the Su-9 impractical as a strategic interceptor. Because NATO had a growing number of strategic bombers, all of which were capable of delivering nuclear weapons from standoff distances, the Soviet Ministry of Defense ordered the development of a new, long-range, high-altitude, high-speed interceptor. By design, these interceptors lacked the customary armaments found aboard modern-day fighters, including autocannons and the normal contingent of close-range missiles. Indeed, their sole mission was to find and destroy NATO bombers and reconnaissance planes, preferably from beyond visual range. These heavy interceptors, as they came to be known, were never intended for dogfighting. Development of this next-generation interceptor ultimately befell the Mikoyan-Gurevich Design Bureau. The true genesis of the MiG-25, however, remains somewhat of a mystery. According to one legend, the story of the MiG-25 began when Chief Designer Artyom Mikoyan returned to Russia following his visit to the Paris Air Show in 1959. Having seen the latest and greatest of NATO's aircraft, Mikoyan suggested that his project designer, Yakov Seletsky, begin researching designs for a new interceptor comparable to the North American A-5 Vigilante, but powered by twin engines. Official state records, however, indicate that Mikoyan had initiated the design planning before any information was available on the A-5 Vigilante. These records further indicate that sketches were available by 1958, but serious design work did not begin until mid-1959. These initial designs